Yes. Can I start? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to this webinar on the impact assessment study carried out by Athena on the ITIs being run by CII members across southern region. This study, you are aware, was carried out last year by Athena and the initiative of CII Central Office, and has come out with its findings for the southern region. And in the next 1 hour or so, Deepa will be doing a presentation and explaining the final system or the final recommendations about the scheme and their findings, which I think are going to be very useful for the ITI IMC members to understand what the issues are in the ITI IMC, and they can take some positives out of it and wait for the next addendum to the blue book, which is also a part of the series which has been planned as part of the study. To introduce you to Deepa Karthikeyan, she is the founder director of Athena Informatics, which is a good consultancy agency, and we have been working with them for the last 2 years. They have done the 10 HR study assessment report. They have also done the skill gap study for Tamil Nadu, the district-wise skill gap study, and this study is being done on a national stage. They have done 100 ITIs. In the southern region, they have done for 26 ITIs. Without wasting any more time, I hand over to Deepa.
Thank you so much, Mr. Raghunathan. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, on behalf of CII, I'd like to thank you all for showing interest in this study that we have undertaken in collaboration with the Confederation of Indian Industry. I think it's very important before we discuss the key findings and the outcomes of the study to sort of lay the context in which the study was conceived, and very importantly what this presentation will talk about in the next 1 hour, which is I think the time that's been given to us. So firstly, it's important for us to all sort of be on the same page. This study was taken up at the national level. 100 ITIs were okay, next slide. Okay, but 100 ITIs were primary surveys, and 100 ITIs were undertaken to understand and evaluate whether this scheme that the Ministry of Labour and Employment had launched in the year 2007 was creating any positive impact at all. If so, in what direction? If not, why? If you can all see the slide that's put up here, you will see that what's critical to this entire process is to understand the structure in which the scheme is designed to operate. The IMC, as most of us, I think, I'm certain most of the audience who are with us here today understand how the structure operates, but for those of you who are perhaps new to the idea, the IMC is the Institute Management Committee that has been established with an intent to function as a special purpose vehicle of sorts, through which monies can be sort of channelized to create incremental capacities and bring about improvements within the ITI. And these improvements are primarily targeted towards one very specific objective, which you will see is being stated on the right, which says improving employment as well as employability. So far, about 1,175. Is that right, Anu? I'm sorry, just before I go forward, I have my colleague Anupama, who actually conducted the primary survey here with me, who will also be taking us through her experiences and insights from what she gathered over the last 6 months. So about 1,000 and odd ITIs have already been adopted under the scheme, and close to 3,000 crores has been disbursed. But despite this very large outlay and the potential positive socio-economic impact that this scheme holds, there has been no evaluation whatsoever so far on how the scheme has performed. More importantly, any information that is today available in the public domain is primarily anecdotal in nature. So in this context, the Confederation of Indian Industry was keen to evaluate, to sort of undertake an objective assessment of the impact that the scheme has had and how well it has performed. And as I mentioned right at the outset, if it has performed well, why? And if not, why not? About 100 ITIs were adopted across the country, 26 being in the south. Over 1,000 stakeholders, including IMC chairman, principal, and faculty members, students were interviewed in the course of the study across these 100 ITIs. there were three key things that we brought out as a part of the study, and which have all been submitted and now are at various stages of iteration with both central and state governments. The first and the most critical, we believe, from a CII point of view, is what we call our regional assessment reports. Now, these reports provide detailed profiles of every ITI, thereby allowing either the ITI representatives or stakeholders themselves or CII to make ITI-specific interventions. Here, an objective performance ranking system has been evolved, and every ITI has been given a score across various parameters such as student mobilization, industry linkage, training quality, and a whole bunch of other larger parameters. So you will very specifically know, for example, an ITI A is doing well on 4 things, scoring above a 3.5 perhaps, but is not doing too well, let's say, on industry linkage. And it will also tell you, these detailed profiles will also tell you why they are not doing well on a certain parameter, thereby providing you with all the raw material that one will need to be able to make targeted ITI-specific interventions. The second is what we call our insights and recommendations report, and this is what the presentation today will focus on, which is a summary of all the key, where we've extrapolated a lot of the micro nuances and findings that came out of the study, and we sort of extracted it and discussed what are therefore the broad systemic issues that affect the system, and what sort of recommendations should be taken up at the systemic level. And this is primarily targeted for policymakers, state governments and central governments, who actually have a mandate and the power really to do it. And finally is what we call an addendum, which takes up one specific recommendation we've made, which is to put together a performance assessment framework and sets out a set of detailed guidelines on how an ITI can monitor and measure its progress and performance. I'm very quickly going to go into how the study was structured and the key insights that came out of our data analysis and primary surveys. Right at the outset, when we started off the study, we said there are a number of ways in which, or a number of factors that can contribute to the success or the failure of the scheme. And we broadly classified them into 2 baskets. We call them internal and external. What do we mean by this? We said there are a number of factors that continue to influence how successfully the scheme operates on the ground, which I am currently using as being synonymous with how effectively the IMC operates, which are not really within the control of the IMC at all, which are entirely exogenous to the Institute Management Committee. And the IMC has almost little or no control on these factors, but they still tend to sort of affect the IMC's ability to carry out the mandate that the scheme has bestowed on it. And then there is the second block, which we call the internal factors, and this we believe is more within the direct control of the IMC, but sort of go on to comment how effectively is an IMC using these various, we call them enablers, we can call them parameters, or these levers perhaps that are made available to them and that are within their control, and to what extent are they being utilized by the IMC as a committee to actually bring about improvements at the ITI level. So this is the broad framework within which the rest of the analysis has been structured. And we go on to systematically understand what are these external factors that affect the IMC's ability to perform, and what are those factors that are within the IMC's control but affect its ability to perform. Now, the systemic factors we've again gone on to broadly classify as being systemic hurdles and scheme drawbacks. Here, simply as the name suggests, systemic hurdles are those factors that are system-driven and sort of pre-existed the introduction of the scheme, and scheme drawbacks are those specific drawbacks that are still beyond the control of the IMC, but are in relation to ambiguities, loopholes, gaps that the scheme in itself presents, making it difficult for the IMC to operate effectively. On the systemic hurdles, we've tried to sort of simplify the process and classify all these large issues into 4 or 5 baskets. The first being what we call low labor market outcomes, and we saw 2 critical, the first most striking thing for us in the study was when we went on calculating the throughput, that is, when we looked at the number of students who were actually entering ITIs against those that were passing out and were being placed, it was about 37%. And I think what's important for us all to take note of here is that that 37% also includes apprenticeship, right? Which is, I would say, about 70% of that 37% is apprenticeship, where, you know, and we noticed that as a nomenclature, ITIs tended to sort of confuse training with employment, which meant that students who were placed as apprentices, they default assumed that they'd already placed them, which was not the case. And if you see point number 2, we discovered that less than 2% of the candidates who were actually sort of entering these industries as apprentices were actually being absorbed. So clearly there was, ITI as a structure in itself, because of various larger legislations like the apprenticeship legislation that makes it very difficult for candidates to be effectively absorbed, had low labor market outcomes. And these were completely outside the control of the ITI. Another thing that we discovered was a number of, I mean, what is the criteria behind which you know, an organization or an entity or the government goes about deciding where an ITI is located? There are developmental motives, there are political motives, there are also sometimes obvious industrial motivations, and we've discovered that if you actually look at the larger basket, a number of these ITIs were located in areas where there was almost no proximity to industrial you know, hubs or any kind of industrial activity. And we, our analysis, we noticed that there was a very negative spillover effect that this had, which meant an ITI, for example, you know, off the cuff, an ITI Tinsukia, by virtue of being situated next to an industrial, would have a positive spillover effect across, which meant they would do better on student mobilization, they would do better on, they'd have lower dropout rates, etc. Whereas those that perhaps, you know, a Siliguri or that were located in locations that were not considered as being very industrially active were generally doing not very well. The other critical component, which we think is systemic in nature, is, and I'm certain a lot of you who have adopted and are running ITIs will connect with and empathize with what is being put out there, which is sort of what we call high faculty vacancies and turnovers. Now, one thing we noticed across our 100 ITIs was at any point in time, the number of contract faculty who were operating were on par or were greater than the number of permanent faculty. Now, while contract faculty in itself is not a bad thing, for example, in the Singapore model, it's all contract faculty. What we discovered was actually the weakness in the system was perhaps the incentive structure. So the contractual terms on which these contract faculty were being brought on were extremely unfavorable. They were very short periods of time. The pay levels were very poor. As a consequence of which we noticed that at any point in time, not only were there high vacancies, but the attrition rates were also very high. And this sort of had a very direct adverse impact on the kind of training that was being delivered in these ITIs. Clearly, there is, of course, a state failure to be able to place teachers on time in these ITIs. And I think there are also larger contractual issues that needs to be looked at more carefully. The statistic there says in 72% of the cases, people were depending on contract faculty primarily for filling their faculty needs. And I think a very important and critical point we want to make here is, from an IMC point of view, this has a very heavy development cost, because the IMC has a 2.5 crore rupee fund that it is expected to spend in a manner where it creates where you tend to prioritize capital infrastructure related incremental areas over revenue, perhaps. I mean, if you look at it from a policy development opportunity point of view. And we discovered that by forcing the IMC to fill in these vacancies through contract labor, you were actually offsetting their ability to spend that money more effectively on creating capital infrastructure and other incremental capacities. The other element, I think, which is institutional in nature but very critical to highlight, is we discovered that almost, if you see the graphic there, almost all the ITIs that we visited were predominantly dependent on what you call government refresher courses to, upskill and develop faculty skills. And if you actually look at the institutional system today that's available to train faculty, there are about 19. Anu, if that's right, 19 ATIs in the country, but 1,600 is the capacity today. just today, if you take a student to teacher ratio of 20:1, you need 60. Am I audible? Okay, about 60,000 instructors as on date. So I'm talking about a massive institutional deficit today to train teachers, over and above which. Sure, continue. Should I continue? Am I clear? Okay, great. Sorry, I apologize for that minor technical difficulty that we just had. So moving forward, we discovered that there is a massive institutional deficit today in terms of teacher training, and the government already has an announcement where it is seeking to set up 1,500 more ITIs, and this is only going to further widen this deficit. Now, another critical bit that we noticed, which was exogenous to the IMC, but was very critical and had an impact on the overall ability of the system to deliver, was the fact that contract faculty, despite being a fairly important, despite playing a fairly important part in the overall faculty structure at any point in time, were not allowed access to government refresher courses. Now, we see that as being a very big disadvantage when it comes to faculty training and the quality of training that gets delivered. Another critical thing which has been talked about but little has been done, it's one of those issues that perhaps gets repeated in every presentation but nothing gets done about it, is curriculum. And we've discovered that, leave alone commenting on the mechanism, only 18 of the, if you look at that graphic there, it says only 18 of the 120 courses that are being offered at ITIs have been revised, and less than one after 2010, and less than 1/3 have undergone revision since 2005. These are numbers that give you a sense of the absolutes, but over and above this, I think there are some very critical underlying questions on the mechanism for curriculum development and updation in itself, which today is largely unclear. And the role that perhaps industry should play in that element or that segment is something that needs to be deliberated and taken up, in a fairly more serious way. Another thing that we thought was external to the IMC but still affected its ability to perform were a number of delays that were seen to occur. And this is, as a proxy, we discovered that the actual expenditures as against what these IMCs had planned as being what they wanted to spend was just half the Indian average, and that pattern continues to remain across the northwest and the south, east and the northeast being the only outlier where they've almost spent what they had planned. And we realized that these delays were either because the new trades that the IMC wanted to introduce within the as a part of the scheme wasn't being approved. It was because of the bureaucracy and the difficulties associated with modifying the IDPs that was, to begin with, a hastily put together document with, in many cases we discovered minimal buy-in from all stakeholders. The delay in construction by government agencies in Tamil Nadu is a classic case in point, where, the interpretation of the Tender Transparency Act has been construed to say that only PWD can undertake construction of within government premises, which sort of, and PWD does not obviously have the incentive to take up smaller contracts, leave alone their larger governmental backlogs, in which these create delays. And I think the critical point is also the rented premises area, which hasn't been sort of addressed very effectively. And this, I think, was a stark concern in Karnataka, where by virtue of being located in a rented premise, one is, of course, the ability to build incremental infrastructure, and therefore to spend the monies that was then being invested with them was very low. Another key critical area we thought that also was outside, which also tended to affect the IMC's performance, was the frequent transfer of principals or the absence of full-time principles. Now, IMC being a supra committee, every stakeholder needs to sort of have a stake and coordinate with one another to be able to make the entire scheme function seamlessly. And we discovered in 16 out of the 100 ITIs, a dedicated principal was not available, which meant either the principal was not available at all, or one principal was deployed in multiple ITIs, which made it very difficult for them to take on full administrative responsibility for any single ITI at a point in time. This brings me back to some of our scheme-related drawbacks, and I think over and above these systemic challenges, and I think in the Q&A I'll be happy, we'll be happy, both Anu and I, if you could point us to other systemic issues or challenges that you faced that you think is critical for us to include in the study. But over and above the systemic challenges, we discovered there are a number of scheme-related drawbacks. One, and for us, it's not in any order of priority, but one of the most critical challenges was the fact that funds were not linked to outcomes. The disbursement was made as a lump sum right at the outset, which meant there was no incentive for the stakeholders, whether it's the industry partner or the ITI representative, to actually deliver or even proactively set targets, etc., that were relevant to what the ITI needs to fulfill. The QPR, as most of you know, is primarily an input-based, how much have you spent sort of a framework, and which only tracked performance based on your ability to spend what was given to you. And we think that's that is not necessarily an appropriate way of going about, implementing the scheme. The second we noticed was the weak role for an associate industry partner. The scheme as a structure does not necessarily institutionalize or sort of it lays down a broad directive saying that the associate industry partner could perhaps support in placement, could perhaps support in training quality, but does not provide them with an institutional role, which gives them the option of not participating in the scheme itself. And I think this is what the statistics tell us. We've discovered that in 27% of the cases, only the principal industry partner has contributed, and in 21%, none of the industry partners have contributed to the scheme at all, which means in almost 50% of the cases, the role of the industry partner has remained weak, and in half of that, only the principal industry partner has actually played an active role. And finally, and I think this is where we see a fundamental gap between what the policy seeks to achieve and what the scheme seeks to achieve and what's happening on the ground. The IMC as a body is a voluntary body which is registered as a society. Accountability is unclear. There is no shared economic interest. But the scheme, by virtue of motivations that they think are beyond these two, expects the entity to be accountable for what it's expected to deliver as per the mandate of the scheme, and we see that as being a very weak link, where if an industry partner does not perform, if a principal does not necessarily coordinate or support the delivery of the scheme, what means do the government have to be able to enforce accountability in a structure like this? And I think that's very critical, and that we think is again a critical drawback in the scheme that hasn't been addressed. Now, if you broadly look at, this is the universe of issues that we think are structural and scheme related in nature. And we've then gone about to understand, okay, how have IMCs responded to these structural issues? Because at the end of the day, the central purpose of the scheme is to say, we know there are issues with the way ITIs operate, but is there something that this newly created entity called the IMC can do to battle or overcome these challenges that have been presented, or that have continued to sort of harass the vocational education system in the past? And we discovered that 27%, that's about 27 of the 100 ITIs that we visited, were very proactive, were using 50% or more of the enablers, and there was a great degree of commitment, and we saw distinct improvements between 2007 and 2010 that was being brought about within the ITI in terms of placements, in terms of dropout rates, etc. Then there is, and we call them the exemplar models. Then there is a second block, and we call them the aspirants, where we say there is certainly a certain degree of commitment. The IMC chairman and the ITI stakeholders seem to be doing something on the ground, and we said anywhere between 20 to 50% of the IMC enablers are being utilized, and there is some level of commitment that we see from the IMC stakeholders to want to deliver. But there are a number of issues that are either competence related or are structural barriers that prevent them from delivering what they are mandated to deliver. And we call them aspirants because we believe that this is a section of people who want to be a part of the scheme, who want to do more, but aren't in a position to do so either for competence related issues or structural matters. And then there is a final block, and we call them the laggards, where we see a clear lack of commitment to participate in the scheme and the highest degree of structural disability. This has further been divided into two groups, and we call them, there is one group within type 3 where we see there is the highest level of structural disability, which means out of the 51 ITIs, we've discovered that there is a section that cannot do more because there are very severe structural disadvantages that affect them. But even among these 51, we saw there were 21 ITIs where it was just a clear lack of commitment. Either they had no IMC chairman that was present in the picture, there was no activity whatsoever. IMC chairman were never seen to be attending the meetings and things like that. So this for us really sort of reinforced the hypothesis that if driven by competent and committed individuals, the systemic challenges can be overcome. But it also highlighted the fact that IMCs that displayed these qualities were really in the minority. We sort of then wanted to go about and see what it is that these exemplar models were doing right, that helped them do what they did, and what is it that the aspirants and laggards were suffering from. And we discovered these were the key positive traits. The first was, and we believe, and this is something we've also strongly recommended for in the report, is the presence of a dedicated IMC chairman or director. In the absence, in cases where the IMC chairman is conventionally a very senior officer, the IMC as a group can come together and collectively appoint a manager who runs the ITI. And we discovered that top performing ITIs would always seem to have a dedicated and proactive chairman who was full-time and who was fully hands-on and involved in running the ITI. The second was what we call a regular review of goals. We discovered, and we put this down as a pertinent issue because we believe that a lot of the times, if you looked at the data, the ITI would have achieved 70% placements last year, and their target for next year would be 65. Which means a complete misalignment between how the ITI was doing on the ground and what they wanted to achieve over and above what it was doing on the ground, which meant most of them didn't have a clue or didn't care. And this was data that went on record, and that was submitted in these reports to the SSCs and NSCs and just went through the entire chain without being noticed. So we discovered that it's very, very critical for the IMC, and this could even be the responsibility of the manager, to actually have a performance review, a goal-setting mechanism that aligns with the realities of the ITI. ITI Barnala was a very interesting case study for us there, where they had developed something called as an activity sheet, which was used to create and follow up on implementation plans. There were action reports that were prepared regularly, and the IMC meetings were conducted on in a monthly fashion with very defined agendas and action points. And every time they met again, they said, okay, we haven't done these 6 things, so should we be doing something different? Active participation by all IMC members is again very, very critical, because today the biggest weakness in an ITI is its inability to respond to the labor market demands. And I think industry plays a critical role there, and we want to see more. Whether or not the guideline provides for an institutional role, we strongly encourage the associate members and the industry members to play a stronger role. Strong industry linkages, which meant having a strategy to strengthen industry linkage. And there were some interesting case studies there. I think one, and which stood out for me, was the ITI Nalagarh example, where it was not only about strengthening industry linkage, but they also used it as a tool, as a revenue generation tool. And what they did was, the students were placed in a dual system of training, which is to strengthen industry linkage. There was a bit of a minor apprenticeship that was being implemented in the course of the ITI program, over and above what you had to compulsorily do after the ITI program. And they discovered that these students got paid a certain stipend to sort of go in as summer interns in these various organizations. Whatever stipend that the student was paid, a small portion of it was set aside to sort of maintain a placement cell, a 15% component. And we said, and a certain portion went into generating revenues for the larger, benefit of the ITI. And there are various such case studies. I think these are covered in our report and our policy note as well, and will be made available to all of you who are interested. Then there is what we call the critical element of quality of training, or which we think is again a very weak area today in ITIs. When you really look at the quality of training, again, of course, here there are IMCs that have done extremely well to overcome institutional deficits, not depend on government refresher courses, but undertake in-house upskilling, skill competitions, have a larger variable pay in the overall pay structure that's being designed for these for the faculty. And one, again, I think I'm going back to ITI Nalagarh and also Narayanpur in the north, which sort of had an interesting system where 33% of the IMC proceeds were set aside to actually incentivize teachers on a set of predetermined criteria where their performance was evaluated and they were given incentives on the same. Finally, there is what we call financial behavior, and we discovered that the IMCs that did well were all seen to display prudent financial behavior, and we had an interesting, approach to go about thinking about this, and we sort of broadly classified all the IMCs into 4 categories, and this is how our classification worked. On one end of the spectrum, we have what we call the extremely conservative group, and conventionally the behavior that this group displayed was that they would set aside a very large sum, 50% of 2.5 crores as seed money, and they would undertake no revenue generation activity. All they would do is set aside this 100, maybe 70 lakhs or 75 lakhs as seed money, and whatever is the interest proceeds that one can accrue of it is used to generally, it's like saying, okay, I've hedged myself against any default risk, and since I assume that money is the only liability that falls on me, if I've hedged myself against that risk, that's all I'm expected to do. The second group is what we call conservative and prudent. So the extremely conservative group will invariably show 100% repayability. Okay, when we also did a detailed assessment of their default risks, which is also sort of figures in our report, and these guys will always show up as being 100% capable of repaying the loan, but that does not necessarily mean a good thing. There is the second group, what we call the conservative and prudent, which means they do set aside a certain amount to hedge themselves against default risk, but over and above which they're also seen to undertake revenue generation activity, which is for us a very important proxy for how active the IMC is in an ITI. And these groups will generally display 120 or 125 or 150% repayment capability. The third group, and we prescribe this as being the most desirable behavior from a policy point of view, which is what we call the liberal and prudent group, which is this group sets aside a fairly small or nominal amount of seed money and engages more proactively in revenue generation. The reason behind our, the reason behind why we believe that this kind of behavior is effective is primarily from a policy systemic perspective, because when you set aside a large amount of money in a bank, the opportunity cost of not spending that much money on developing the ITI therefore plays a very important role. So in the liberal and prudent category, you're not setting aside too much money. It's not hashed up in a bank account. It's actually money that you're spending to develop the ITI. And number two, you're also undertaking, revenue generation activity over and above that. And then we have our classic case, which is group 4, which we call liberal and imprudent. And to be absolutely candid, these are the ITIs where state governments have perhaps, or the ITIs themselves believe that the loans will be waived, have been on a spending spree, have spent large amounts of money. Their actual, in cases they've spent more money than what they planned to, but they're not really doing too much, or actually any revenue generation at all for that matter. And this is the group where we see the highest default risk in, because they believe that the loan is going to get waived off, and it doesn't matter how or what they do, because at the end of the day they're not liable to repay the amount. And the reason we're bringing up this matrix is we discovered that those IMCs that we call exemplar models predominantly fell in group 2 and group 3. That is, they were conservative and prudent or liberal and prudent. Now going on to understand, I've sort of tried to capture the key areas or sort of levers that helped the group, the exemplar, IMCs to perform well. Now we wanted to sort of broadly understand why the other groups weren't doing so well, and we discovered that the first and the single most important thing that everybody told us almost unanimously is, I don't know why I adopted the ITI. And we had a question, in fact, in our questionnaire that said, what was your motivation behind adopting the ITI? Was it CSR? Was it, and in a large number of cases, the response was a letter from CII. And we discovered that, therefore, there was a lack of orientation, there was a lack of induction. The IMC chairman, the industry partners who were adopting ITIs were not fully clear on what it is that the scheme wanted them to do. And this for us was a very critical factor. In about 26, about 26 principles saw dual administrative control in ITI's post-adoption, and we discovered that a lot of this was because of lack of role clarity. A second thing that that became quite abundantly clear in our stakeholder interviews was the fact that there was no alignment between the different stakeholders who were part of the IMC on what it is that the IMC should achieve. And this was creating, was actually sort of sharpening this dual management perception that they were beginning to sort of see, where they saw the IMC, the industry partner, operating in a different way, doing a set of things that were entirely different from how the ITI principal or the representatives were running the institute. And in several cases, both these models tended to very comfortably coexist. Absence of a smooth handover process we again saw as being a critical point, and here I think it predominantly traces back to the role that the industry plays. We discovered in several cases the chairmen tend to get transferred, and there is no leadership succession plan in the sense. So there is a period between when the chairman gets transferred or a local manager gets transferred and a new one gets replaced, that nothing happens in the ITI. So, having a smooth handover, and there is also, of course, there is no knowledge system really. There is no knowledge management. There is no performance targeting. So you're operating in a systemic vacuum to begin with. So if there are no people as well, then the whole thing comes to a standstill. The final two are what we call, there is a basket that we call competence, and then there is another basket that we call commitment. The competence basket we think applies more specifically to what we call the aspirants, where we noticed that their inability to perhaps sometimes bring about changes was simply because the ITI principal or the industry chairman or the industry representative or the faculty did not have the skill sets that was required to be able to deliver the scheme. On the other side is what we call a commitment issue, where clearly the industry partner or the ITI principal were not committed to begin with. They were either not present in the meetings. There were, in 1 out of 5 ITIs we surveyed, there was no dedicated IMC chairman to begin with. And these we think are, which is what I said at the outset, 20 IMCs did not have an IMC chairman of the 100 visited. And I think these are, again, very important issues. This is what the distribution pattern in the southern region looked like. Anu, would you like to talk about this briefly?
Yeah. So in the southern region, most of them, especially in the case of Tamil Nadu, were not able to show significant improvement because of a lot of the government orders and PWD delays and everything. But we did not have this third category where we said that IMC chairman was completely missing. That was not in the case of southern region. We had all IMC chairman present, but the major issues that were faced in this region was absence of dedicated principal. You had government delays. You didn't have proactiveness from the IMC members to do soft skill training in some of the ITIs. They were largely depending on government refresher training for faculty development. There were a lot of delays in course approval. There were a lot of delays in faculty recruitment, both from IMC and as well as the government end.
What you see up there really is a basket of reasons, I think, that was state specific, that prevented these states from doing more. I think this is primarily to illustrate what are those issues that were very region specific, but we see a certain degree of factors that broadly cut across ITI. Some of them are perhaps more relevant elsewhere, like Anu pointed out. The lack of clear commitment is not really an issue in the South. We see there being a certain degree of commitment, but we see there being a very high level of structural structural disabilities that I think needs to be picked up and dealt with in independent conversations with each of these state governments and other stakeholders. The way forward, therefore, for us was really very similar to how we went about diagnosing this issue. And we said every block, therefore, had a unique set of challenges and opportunities, and therefore the interventions, therefore, should be unique. Clearly, we did not. Our focus was primarily on type 2 and type 3. Does not mean the exemplar models do not have issues, but there is already so much that's happening in that group, and they're already setting an example for how you can do these 10 things differently or more effectively. We said, okay, let's focus more on aspirins and laggards and see what are the specific interventions that one can bring out. In aspirins, as I mentioned earlier, we noticed that they were inhibited either because of a capability issue or because of the lack of a facilitative environment. And here we have suggested a set of structural reforms and capacity building interventions to go about making it easier for them to do more, maybe even much more than what the exemplar models are doing today. And then we have what we call the type 3, and of which 30% we saw was, again, a problem that was very similar to the type 2, but, was a difference of degree rather than type. Were more, they had a much stronger level of disability. Locational disadvantage could have been absolutely severe. State governments could have been highly restrictive. So they probably were tied down by structural aspects that were of a higher degree in nature, while the 21% we clearly and simply by virtue of lack of, are clearly a problem of lack of commitment. And we think this box that's highlighted in red will have to therefore be dealt with very differently. So what are the key structural reforms and capacity building interventions that, the next section sort of broadly lays out what are the structural reforms and capacity building interventions that we've suggested to be able to make the group 2 and a section of the group 3 do more. And here we've suggested 4 broad things. The first being what we call a performance management and quality assurance framework. Now, this for us is directly targeted at 2 or 3 things. One is we discovered that the current reporting system is highly biased towards expenditure patterns and is more input based, is not outcomes based, and that we thought had to change. And the other thing that we noticed was that there was no goal setting whatsoever, and what the ITI was planning for itself was completely misaligned with what was happening on the ground. So we've sort of built a performance management and quality assurance framework where we've sort of put down a value chain, and this is there in our report, where we believe a certain amount of self-assessment and audit needs to be performed by the IMCs on a larger number of parameters, which we think, and we are pushing for a policy reform, should be annexed to the QPR. So effectively, we're not saying do away with the QPR because it's already in effect and is being filled out, but we've recommended that the central government look at elaborate or expanding this to include outcomes that really are representative of what an ITI should deliver and what an IMC should deliver within the context of the scheme. The second is what we call a hub and spoke model, and we discovered that in several cases, this is directly targeted to a couple of disadvantages. One is we noticed that in ITIs that had a locational disadvantage and couldn't do much simply because they weren't situated close to a hub or an industry hub. We believe that in order to help them overcome that disadvantage, we'll need to sort of create a hub and spoke framework where you have a cluster of ITIs that sort of are linked to a hub, and this hub will perform a number of services for these ITIs to create a facilitative environment for them to do more. One of the things we want the hub to do clearly is to act as a central aggregator of demand and supply, which means, for example, we notice there are ITIs that are in these remote locations that have 80 students. That is their capacity, but they will have, for 80 students, having a placement cell does not make sense. Why then? Can we then sort of, tap in on the economies of scale and have a central hub that will sort of which will aggregate supply, which means it will say, okay, I have these 5 spoke ITIs that are linked to me. I have these 20 trays that are being offered across this entire cluster. This is the total number of students that will be passing out. And then also act as an aggregator of demand to say, okay, these are the X number of employment opportunities that are going to be made available for these different trades, and then bring both of these together. The other thing that we saw was a lot of the ITIs were severely constrained on the infrastructure front to begin with. And 2.45 crores is almost nothing to actually create incremental capacities where you're starting literally from scratch. And in those cases, we discovered again a hub and spoke model where the hub again provides a central set of infrastructure facilities to the spokes, will again help these spokes to perform better. It could be something as simple as a central large library or a central data collection system. Or other computer labs perhaps that the students can come and access. Of course, there will have to be a series of criteria on how the hub gets selected, how the spokes get selected, so that issues of geography don't sort of play spoil sport. And the other thing that we discovered was a clear case. In fact, one of the things that we were also discussing with a key member in the skill committee in the South was the issue of very high overheads. For example, going back to my example of 80 students per ITI would have 7 courses or 5 courses. It didn't make sense for a very small ITI of so few students to offer a large number of trades, because just from an inventory perspective, maintaining 5 trades just does not make economic sense. And we said, therefore, there must be a system by which the spokes focus on trades that are extremely relevant to local demand, maybe just 2 or 3 at most. And of course, we can we can have a simple formula that links it to critical mass. And then we went on to sort of say, while the hub can perhaps perform, provide a larger variety, and say that, and which also means one of the criteria that you will choose the hub by is the critical mass criteria. So this hub and spoke framework, we said, therefore can operate on a number of fronts. It can act as an infrastructure center. It can act as a center to sort of provide training on advanced modules or on trades which demand a high critical mass. It can act as a demand and supply aggregator. It can act as a placement point for the students. So there are a number of things that can sort of be built into this hub and spoke framework. And now this is being fleshed out in detail at the central level to see if we can pilot this framework in a set of states to see how this will function. Of course, the costing of it is still being developed on who will pay. Will this come out of the IMC funds? Will there be a pool that will be set aside where there will be a cost-sharing structure between the spoke and the hub ITIs? And that segment is still being worked out and will be detailed in the pilots. And the third and one of the biggest issues we faced when we were visiting these ITIs was data. There was no data. There was no control group whatsoever prior performance, prior the introduction of the scheme, that gave us almost nothing to actually evaluate the success of the scheme on. And therefore, we said there must be a system of data collection, measurement, and monitoring. And this is again another idea that we're hoping to pilot, hopefully with in a couple of months, with the concurrence of CII and the relevant state and central government authorities, which is to sort of develop an MIS system. And this can also sort of be nicely retrofitted into your hub and spoke framework, wherein you actually develop, we even have a sample dashboard that's being put up. This is simply to illustrate the kind of, this is conventionally the variables on which data is currently being collected. We said, okay, so there must be a way in which I should be able to raise red flags. I say, okay, I'm doing X this year. I want to be doing Y next year. If I don't match up, then there must be a system by which these red flags get raised, and it becomes a functional imperative for the IMC stakeholders to sort of act on these red flags. This again is being developed in a detailed fashion and hopefully will be piloted. Finally is what we call capacity building, and I think for us this is a critical component and sadly one that has been underinvested in so far, where we believe that lack of orientation towards what the scheme seeks to achieve, a clarity on the key roles and responsibilities that different stakeholders are supposed to perform, how goal setting it conventionally functions in an industry setup and how it may function, it may function in an ITI setup. What are the best practices that are available across the board and can be sort of, like a compendium that gets distributed and talked about. A lot of these things we believe should happen, and not enough of it is happening today. And we believe a combination of, or we recommend that a combination of these structural reforms to offset the structural issues that ITIs face today, coupled with strong capacity building interventions for stakeholders, will in essence solve about 70% of my issues. right? So which addresses my block 2 and a portion of my block 3. There is, of course, the block 4, which is for me those ITIs or IMCs that have shown absolutely no commitment whatsoever. And here I think in the absence, excuse me. Yeah. So in the absence of an accountability structure, in the absence of a clause in the scheme that can enforce accountability, getting these stakeholders in their current format to show more accountability is going to be very difficult. And in that group of ITIs, we have clearly recommended doing away with the PPP scheme and replacing it with a more efficient and alternate, a more efficient alternative. And one suggestion, which is one of the hypothetical frameworks, and of course, if this gets picked up and talked about in greater detail, I think a number of options and models can be designed, evolved, and applied on the ground, is a design, build, operate, and transfer model. And one of the things that we've suggested is to go with a DBOT with a simple 10-year lease. A clear incentive or incentive structure gets built into the system contractually, and the private player is given a great deal of autonomy to be able to sort of intervene and undertake what he or she desires to within the contractual process, like, you know, pretty much like what happens today in the infrastructure sector. Of course, with some special, given that this is a social development space, with some special allowances which needs to be detailed out. These were our key recommendations, and hopefully, I hope that now the Confederation of Indian Industry, the respective state governments and central government agencies will come together and take some of this forward, and we hope to see a lot more improvement and a lot less of what has been happening ever since the vocational system in India was sort of designed and implemented. So I think that's pretty much where we end. I'll be happy to take questions now. Should I? Okay, so I have one Mr. Jay Chandra from Aradhya who's asked us, is in CII Blue Book and DGET norms talk about 50%, that's 1.25 crores of seed money, is it mandatory? No sir, it's not mandatory. I think the reason that they prescribe these norms is perhaps to help industry stakeholders hedge themselves against a default risk.
And it's a maximum you can keep as a seed money. 1.25.
You can't, yeah, it's a threshold, which means you can't set aside more than 50% of 2.5 crores, but it does not mean that you have to set aside 2.5 crores. There are IMCs that have only set aside 10 lakhs and are doing extremely well, sir. In fact, if you've sort of seen our financial prudence matrix, I think we prescribe, you know, if you have the confidence in revenue generation, we prescribe not setting aside a very large seed money aside. We have another question again from Mr. Jay Chandra himself, which says, can government give training contract to private industries or organization to train the training officer, JTO, as faculty development program annually?
Yes. There are ITIs, there are a lot of ITIs which have adopted this. They provide their own in-house training through the industry partners. For example, ITI Mettur Dam, so which has been adopted by JSW. They use their own employees to provide sort of training for their faculty. They have tied up with a Polytechnic Institute near in that vicinity to provide faculty training for contract faculty. So these are possible.
Right. Right. So I think then we have a few comments from Mr. Jay Chandra, which says he agrees with us on the reasons, and he says more than 60% of the ITIs are running in rented premises. Yes, sir. We only visited 9 of these, of which 3 were running on.
No, 4.
4 were running on rented premises at that point, which is almost 50%. Of course, our sample was restricted to 9 in Karnataka. It was not the entire universe.
But in Andhra Pradesh also you had this case of rented premises, but most of the, at least we have only done a sample of 4 in Andhra Pradesh, of which 2 of them were initially operating in rented premises, but under the PPP scheme, they were able to relocate to a completely new infrastructure, new buildings, which has improved the training quality significantly. But that's the case of Andhra Pradesh. In Karnataka, while the government had assured that they will be moved, while we were doing the study, that hasn't happened.
Right. We have another question again on seed money from Mr. Sridhar Krishnamurthy of Hyundai, IMC Ulundurpet. So yes, there is no norm in the guideline that tells you how much seed money you should set aside, except for the sentence that says you cannot set aside more than 1.25 crores as seed money, which means that is the most you can set aside. So between 0 and 1.25 crores, it is left to the discretion of the industry chairman and the IMC stakeholders on what they should set aside as being seed money, sir. So that I think is adequately clear. And we've discovered that a lot of this is a function of how risk averse or risk loving. So we've noticed that these large corporations, who don't see, for whom a default risk of 2.5 crores is not much, generally have the propensity to set aside smaller amounts because, default risk isn't a big concern. But we've noticed among small and medium enterprises and corporations where there is a certain fear of default risk, they are less risk loving, they are more risk averse, and they tend to set aside 50% or a very large sum like 70 lakhs as seed money. But it is not mandatory, and we'd like to clarify that.
And there have been some state governments which have been recommending that you keep a larger proportion of your money in the seed, but that is a state program. It's not. Right. It's not under the guidelines.
Right. We have Mr. Satya Narayana, who's then telling us that contract faculty are allowed for all trainings in Andhra Pradesh. I think this is in response to Mr. Jayachandra Aradhya. He's contributing as well. There is one Lieutenant Colonel V. Sundaramurthy who has asked us, what are the IMC enablers? So what I will do is I will actually quickly take you through the enablers that we have. Just a second. Can I just click on this? Okay, is it on the other pen drive? Is it?
This must be in your computer, right?
Yeah, it's here. Okay, this is just a sample of the report. So, I'm just putting up, I don't know if you can see this, but you can? Okay, so what we've done is we put up the IMC enablers. This is only visible to me, right? Yeah. So it won't block the other people. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm just getting a technical clarification. So if you can see, we have various categories. We have something called student mobilization. And these categories and the IMC enablers were defined after a first set of pilot interviews where we did about 20, and then we said, okay, these are not absolute scales that these are things that are actually being done in India by ITIs, and we said, okay, can I then define these as being the enablers that must be or can be used by the IMC stakeholders to bring about improvements, and are they doing it at all? So you have something called student mobilization and training. You have training quality. You have industry linkage and placement, whether it's a functional placement cell, is there a skill gap analysis of the region being done? Is there regular feedback from the recruiters and the alumni? Is the IMC proactively encouraging the ITI to participate in job melas? Are they registering students in employment exchanges, state portals? In fact, we also looked at whether they register students on other private, like Naukri.com, private portal. Is soft skills being delivered? Is there entrepreneurship assistance to students? Is there captive recruitment that the industry is undertaking? Guest faculty from industry? Does industry employ? Does industry sort of deploy some of its employees as faculty? A lot of this is being done, sir, by the way. Industrial visits, is there in-plant training for students? Are there production cum training units? These were the kind of enablers, sir. And finally, you have financial planning and governance, where we've looked at a combination of what they are doing to generate revenue and how are they governing their structure. How well designed the IDP is. Is there a structured performance review mechanism? Is there a regular review of financial expenditure plans? Are there performance-linked incentives and rewards for key staff? Is there a sustainable revenue generation? Are there sustainable revenue generation activities or mechanisms? We looked at the right balance between seed money and infrastructure fund. These were the sort of enablers. I hope that clarifies. Okay, we have a number of more questions. So I hope that clarifies. Okay, we have installed a good, we have Jay Chandra, who's again telling us we've installed a good revenue model, multi-brand two-wheeler servicing and training center. So he's telling us about how they have a multimedia and animation training center, but unfortunately their ITI is not able to market it well and mobilize students. Yes, sir, that is a common concern. Which sort of goes back to the question of what courses you pick, what trades you pick, and what is the selection criteria. I think a little bit of a survey among the youth to understand what they want is always seem to be very helpful on matters like this.
I think in this context, I can also mention Mr. Sridhar has joined us, who's from ITI Ulundurpet. He's a nodal officer and the CSR head for Hyundai. So he's been also proposing something very similar for ITI Ulundurpet. One of the problems that ITI Ulundurpet faces is the locational disadvantage. It is sitting in an extremely remote area where there is zero industrial activity, and Hyundai, which operates out of Chennai, has to travel 250 kilometers to visit these ITI. But they are also planning something very similar with the support of Hyundai as well as the other industry partner to build up revenue generation models.
Right. Moving, no, say something else. Okay, one Mr. Mahesh Kiran TV Mahesh Kiran has said, has asked us how feasible would the hub and spoke model be, and will geography, as I said, play spoil sport? As in, will it be feasible for students to move from the spoke to the hub? So that's a very, very valid question, and we think that's exactly what we want to pilot and understand in the set of pilots that we will run, hopefully by the end of this year, where we want to be able to develop a set of criteria, number one, that will say what should a hub be and which of the ITIs could actually function as a spoke, and geography is going to be a critical criteria with which we will be determining these, the hubs and the spokes. Over and beyond this, so we have also internally considered things like incentivizing students to use the facilities that these hubs will provide. And there I think we will need to enter into a dialogue with both the state and other critical stakeholders to see if a system of reimbursing for travel, or even sort of getting having one van that does a circuit, or a simple bus that does a circuit between the hub and the spoke, investing in some permanent transport infrastructure that will do a circuit between the hub and the spoke, making it easier for these students to access the hub infrastructure is also being considered. Hopefully we will be able to answer your questions more adequately once we've run a few pilots, because a lot of this is now at the ideation stage and needs to be fleshed out. But your concern is very valid and we are looking into it, sir. Mr. Sridhar Krishnamurthy has asked us if he can get these slides, and I'll let Colonel, Colonel has promised to send this to those interested. Government, I have again Mr. Jayachandra saying government of Karnataka is imposing GIZ as consultancy to take their guidance by paying rupees 5 lakh.
It's now optional, right?
It's now an optional, but
right, sir. It's certainly not mandatory, but sir, the ITI is a state-owned asset, so which gives the state a great deal of discretionary power to do what it seems is what it deems as being fit. So I think, there is not much scope for comment on that front. Again, I have Mr. Sridhar Krishnamurthy asking me, I want to put my request to get this list of enablers. We shall wish to keep it as a checklist. Certainly, sir, but I think what will be more useful will be your specific ITI profile. That is where we've categorically told you where you're weak or strong and how you've scored on each of these categories. I have Again, Mr. T.B. Mahesh Kiran requesting for the presentation. Mr. Sridhar has also sent us his email ID. Thank you, sir. We'll, on behalf of CII, I think we'll make sure you get this presentation.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
This hub and spoke model will work if this IMC is a common factor for.
It is only in the scheme.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Under the scheme. Now, otherwise you will have differences
Of
between
course.
the IMC. So it has to be like a Maruti Suzuki or a Hyundai with a hub and a spoke. That could have.
You mean where the parent, it's a single parent company?
That would be more easier for coordination. Otherwise, I find it could be.
You think there will be other transaction costs?
Yeah. So that if it's a single IMC like ITI is run by Suzuki or Tata Motors, they have in the South 4 or 5. So that kind of a hub and spoke model would
But
work.
so then geography will play. If
within the state,
it's outside the state.
But I think it's a valid point. I think when we're doing the pilots, I think we'll do a more detailed ideation.
The other points I wanted to ask you was in your report, it's a very nice report. It says that Center of Excellence of courses have not been taken up in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka.
No, they haven't.
Whereas Andhra Pradesh has taken it up and Kerala.
Only the first few ITIs and the first 3 legs have taken up.
There is a lot of failures in the Center of Excellence. There is a lot of hesitancy in the.
We agree.
And there's a recognition problem. I think that is also a thing.
Yes. So, but for example, I think Andhra or Karnataka had come, I forgot which state, but they had come out with a GO which says that the COE courses, for example, welder is equivalent of,
But that has to be
but that only applies to state government recruitment because it's a state GO. You cannot write for railway exams.
That's why people are not taking it up even if they listed it as part of the IDP.
IDPs.
But sir, there is a clear minutes that's been registered under MOLE which says this has to be recognized as soon as possible. This is, you should push it, especially in Tamil Nadu, because it's simply the question of recognition.
So once you get the recognition,
people will be inclined, and COE is deemed to be doing, it's a multi-skilling program. There is advanced modules. Of course, transition has been an issue in areas, but in, for example, the West where we see COEs are doing.
PPP model here in Tamil Nadu, they've not taken it up.
Tamil Nadu and
right. That's because it's also not recognized in the state.
And also state has been also advocating that. They've said that you don't need to take COE. PPP scheme is meant for NCVT courses. That has also been sort of,
Okay, so I have Mr. Pratish Raj asking me, you talked about DBOT principle, but do you think it's a sustainable model? The primary reason for government to implement it is simple. Government functioning has not been up to the mark. Why would you want government to run the ITI? What is the underlying logic of this model? So I'd like to answer that in 2 parts. Number one, I don't think the government's the only reason why the scheme hasn't worked well. I think there are a number of factors, and if you've sort of if you've been a part of the presentation, sir, you will notice that we've also highlighted IMC factors where, IMC stakeholders, whether it's the ITI principal or the IMC chairman, has not been sufficiently proactive. So it's not entirely the government's fault. Number two, sir, this is an area where clear privatization as an option does not exist. It's a social development space, and it's neither something that we would recommend. DBOT does not mean government controls you. It simply means you operate now within a stronger contractual framework where accountabilities are better enforced, but at the same time, the private sector is given a greater degree of autonomy and space and clarity on what it should and should not do, or what it can and cannot do, which does not exist today. So, it's not necessarily the government running the ITI. Firstly, the government will always continue to be the owner of the ITI. You're never going to be able to take that away for some time now. But while the assets are owned by the government, we could go with a simple, DBOT is just one way. We can even go with a simple operate, maintain and transfer model where you have complete autonomy to operate and maintain facilities that the government will create. So we can look at a spectrum, a continuum of PPP models that will still operate more effectively than what the current scheme is doing. And this is again an area that we are going to be investigating in greater detail. But sir, this is, going away from the current system will significantly help provide more autonomy to the private sector to operate. That's the underlying principle, sir. And also will help enforce accountability, which today is not the case. I have one Mr. Premjeet Singh who says, I've been in industry for over 20 years and want to contribute to this cause with my experience and active participation. I'm willing to contribute myself full-time for this. Let me know if there's a possibility, Colonel. So we're very, very happy, that there has been such a positive input. We have Colonel Raghunathan, who heads the skill. He'll pick it up. I think he'll pick up the conversation with you. Again, I have Mr. Sridhar Krishnamurthy saying we take around 1,000 apprentices from the Ambattur area, but surprisingly it is in COE of Maruti. So hub model is not taken care in this. Therefore, now we are planned to support 10 ITIs in Tamil Nadu and spend our money from CSR to teach servicing of cars as additional training where we spend. Sir, firstly, I think that's fantastic. I think this should sort of also be this can be presented as a best practice in the Ulundurpete model if it already hasn't. Is it mentioned in our report? So this is not captured. I think this will definitely be captured in the report. Okay, so I think when my colleague visited the ITI, probably wasn't brought up in the conversation, but we will make sure this gets captured as a best practice in the report and something that can be presented elsewhere as well. And so this whole idea of which IMC chairman should select which ITI has always, the selection criteria is, there is no selection criteria. So I think that obviously answers your question of why you're with Ulundurpete and not Ambattur. So I think that's again, I think the dynamics of this is known to all. So that's really our response. But we're very happy you brought it up. We'll make sure it gets incorporated. Do you have that, Anu? Do you want to take it? So if you just send me an email of what has been done. Do we have any other questions? Sure. Thank you all so very much for the patient hearing, and we hope a lot gets done this year and we see a lot of change.
I'll just do the concluding remarks. I will answer all the queries which people have asked, specifically the slides and the offer for support. I will take it up and follow it up with the concerned persons. I want to thank Athena, Deepa in particular, for having come over here and done this excellent presentation, and the response has been extremely good. And we hope to engage further with the ITI IMC in a more meaningful manner and offer whatever support we can from the CII at the southern region. I also want to inform all the IMC members who are here that the CII Northern Region is having a program of visiting the NTTF facilities for the ITI faculty, and we will send mails. It's on 28th and 29th of May. The participants have to come to Bangalore. It's a 2-day program for improving the faculty development program for the ITI faculty or the vocational training providers. So I will send the details of the program, and we just have vacancies for about 20 to 25 people. It's a 2-day program with NTTF and Toyota. So, and to conclude, I also want to thank Anu and the Athena team for this excellent presentation, and thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. Good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.